We have another packed agenda for you today, with sessions covering the role of a champagne house in helping Churchill sustain freedom, the legacy of the Atlantic Charter meeting, as well as the first reading of a play based on Churchill's extended 1941 stay in the White House. The day will then culminate in the inaugural Stephen and Jane Poss lecture, delivered by the one and only Andrew Roberts. But we start with a more intimate focus on the Churchill Daughters at War. My co-presenter, Catherine, has written the widely acclaimed book, Daughters of Yalta, in which she brilliantly describes the roles played at that key wartime conference by Sarah Churchill, daughter of Winston Churchill, Anna Roosevelt, daughter of President Roosevelt, and Kathleen Harriman, daughter of American ambassador to the Soviet Union, Averell Harriman, all of whom accompanied their fathers to the Yalta Conference. It has been described by the Wall Street Journal as a thoroughly engrossing book, as acute about the contentious politics of the day as it is about the remarkable daughters who participated. But all of Churchill's daughters, Diana, Sarah, and Mary, served in uniform, and as Catherine will explain, Sarah was not the only Churchill daughter to accompany her father on a key wartime trip. Nor is she the only one to be the subject of an important new book. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm absolutely delighted to be here on stage with Emma Soames, who I had the pleasure of meeting for the first time about 4 years ago. Many of you know the story of the series of the fortuitous coincidences that led to my initial introduction to the International Churchill Society by way of a bookstore in the lobby of my office in Manhattan called Chartwell Booksellers. Since then, I've enjoyed every minute of this journey, writing the story of Sarah Churchill, Anna Roosevelt, and Kathleen Harriman together at the Yalta Conference in the Daughters of Yalta. But most of all, it's been such a joy to meet some truly wonderful people, including Emma. When I was just embarking on writing this book, Emma was kind enough to share her mother's papers with me before they were publicly available so that I could better understand the relationship between Sarah and her sister Mary and what remarkable sisters they were, not least because of their contributions during the war. It's a real treat to be here in conversation on this particular topic today. Emma is a writer, broadcaster, and columnist who's been the editor of the Literary Review, Tatler, ES Magazine, The Telegraph Magazine, and Saga. She's also the second child of Mary and Christopher Soames and is the granddaughter of Winston and Clementine Churchill. Her latest book, produced with the Churchill Archive Center in Cambridge, where Mary donated her papers, is Mary Churchill's War. It is a lively, edited version of her mother's wartime diaries. Well, I am so excited that we are here, able to have this conversation with all of you and to shine a light on these truly remarkable daughters of Winston Churchill. And congratulations to you on the publication of your book.
Thank you. I'm following your wake.
Hardly. Well, I thought it would be fun just to kind of start where we could give a bit of background of where Mary and Sarah were in their lives when the war broke out and they decided to join up. So you wanted to tell us a little bit about Mary's life at the time of the war.
Mary was 16. Well, yes, I mean, she was just 17 when war broke out. She started her diary on the 1st of January of that year when she was 16. And by present standards, I say she was more like 14. She was very, very young for her age. And I don't think she'd ever spent a night away from Chartwell at that point. But all was soon to change.
Yes. And Sarah was 8 years older than Mary. She had embarked on an exciting career as an actress and a dancer, which was something a bit unusual for girls of her status and station at the time. But she was very much like her father, as was Mary. They had a lot of the spirit wanting to forge their own path, contribute, and Sarah certainly wanted to make a name for herself on her own terms. And I think perhaps Winston and Clementine weren't quite as scandalized as some other parents might have been by Sarah wanting to be an actress because of Winston's own mother, Jenny Jerome, having been a colorful character in London society. So by contrast, being an actress was quite tame. And Sarah had recently married the star of her first show, Vic Oliver, and she'd run off to America to get married. But unfortunately, when the war broke out, their marriage had also broken down by the time. And so the war was a chance for Sarah to do something new and really discover herself.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Mary was very much the child at home. She was living, obviously at 17, she was living at home, and the first place she moved to was to Admiralty House when her father was made First Lord of the Admiralty. And then she was very excited by that because she had a front door key for the first time in her life. And then, of course, on to number 10 Downing Street the following May. And she was just awakening. There are some charming passages early in the diary. She's just awakening to realizing what a great man her father is when she first goes to hear him in the House of Commons.
Absolutely, and that's something that I want to come back and talk about in a little bit, about the kind of realization of these two daughters about who their father was. But I love the passages early in Mary's diaries where you see kind of the combination of this young woman who is so excited to go out to parties and see her friends, like any teenage girl, but at the same time has such a sense of conviction about the fall of France and Britain's role in preventing a global calamity, and a really articulate sense of geopolitics for someone who is very young. Even, you know, if she's a young 16, 17, she has a very astute mind.
Yes, and you know, the dining room table at Chartwell was a place where great matters were discussed, yes, even if he wasn't an active player in them at that point. So she grew up on a heady diet of geopolitics. And she also, another thing that she, I think, inherited from her father, as indeed did Sarah, which is a compelling sense of duty.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, really, and I think in both their cases, it led to tensions in a way of what they think she ought to do, and what they wanted to do. In my mother's case, that first reared its head when she was wanted to sign up for the ATS. And she was torn because by then she'd become really quite important, particularly in her mother's life, and quite a support to her father as well.
Well, that sense of duty is something that I was very struck by reading Sarah's letters from the time, kind of in the middle of 1940. She's an actress, she was touring with a production, and she went into to see a film one afternoon, and the film reel before it started was some news footage of her father. And Sarah walked out of the theater just welled up with all this pride that she had for her father, and a real desire, she said to him in a letter, of how much she wanted to make him proud of her and to live up to their name and who he was. And so much of it is driven by this duty in the sense that they had a unique place in history and really wanted to live up to the expectations that the world had of them, but that they also had of themselves. And I think that was something that was really unique about both of them in their decision to join up.
Absolutely. And I think they've really... their father was so busy, I mean, you know, running a war. But in a way, once they joined up, they got new respect from him.
Yes.
I mean, my mother mentions that. She quite felt it, that her relationship with her father moved on to a different footing when she joined up, even though it was, you know, Private Churchill doing square bashing at Aldermaston. It wasn't anything very glamorous to start with.
Yes, I loved a letter that Winston wrote to Randolph describing his daughters having joined up, and he says, your sisters have chosen the roughest roads they could find. We think they're very heroic. Yeah. So as much as they admired and respected him, he certainly felt the same way about them, which I think is lovely that he articulated that, because not all fathers of that situation would. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about this rough road that Mary chose and what her active duty life was like.
Well, she was very, again, another sort of example of how torn she was between who she wanted to be and who she was. When she joined up, she was very keen to be just Private Churchill. Hello, is nobody going to notice, you know?
Similar with Sarah, she was married to Vic Oliver at the time, and so she was Section Officer Sarah Oliver, as if no one knew who that was, especially given the fact that she looked exactly like her father with the red hair and everything.
Yeah. But anyway, one day, there she was, trying to pretend she was just a regular private. The War Office decided that she should become the poster girl for recruitment to the ATS. So a pack of photographers came down from London and photographed her in every position you can imagine. And I mean, she just hated it, absolutely hated it. And she was always very worried about what it would do with her relationship with the other girls. But in fact, all it did do is, one, they were sweet to her, but it has also endowed us with a lovely cache of rather good pictures of my mother's scrubbing doorsteps.
Well, that desire to be in the thick of it and not necessarily have special treatment is something that Sarah certainly experienced as well. When she went to the recruitment office, they offered her kind of a fast-track officer position, a cushy desk job, and she really wanted to do something that was real. So she decided to join the women's branch of the Royal Air Force, the WAFs, where she was an aerial reconnaissance intelligence officer. So she would look at photographs that had been taken by recon pilots that were taken thousands of feet in the sky and then make intelligence assessments based on them using kind of trigonometry and slide rules. And she would look at the types of ships that were in enemy harbors and determine what kind they were based on the shadow that they would cast, or look at photographs of fields where the grass had been trampled and try to see if that was because of an enemy troop movement or just some cows grazing. And she really became very intimately aware of many of the specific details of major operations at the time. But it was a hard training program, and she had to pass it just like everyone else.
And she couldn't talk even to her father about it.
Exactly. So I love, there's a story kind of, I think it really shows a lot of the pride that Winston had in his daughters. Sarah came home for leave one weekend, and she went up to see her father, and he said to her, at this very moment, sailing towards the Mediterranean go 542 ships. And she says, actually, Papa, it's 543. And he said, how do you know that? And she said, well, there is such a thing as security. I can't tell you. And turns out she'd been working on Operation Torch for the last many months. And Churchill was so proud of her being so intimately involved in the real work of the war that he went down for dinner, and that night's guest was Eleanor Roosevelt. And so he starts bragging about Sarah and telling the story of how she knew exactly how many ships better than he did. Eleanor Roosevelt turns around and tells the story to the press the next day because she thinks it's so charming. Sarah gets hauled in front of her superiors asking, who leaked this to the press? Who told Mrs. Roosevelt? And she could only say it was my father, and of course there's nothing they can do about it with your father being the prime minister. So I love that. So tell us a little bit about Mary's work in the batteries.
Well, she had a really creditable military career. She was always, if she threw a penny in a fountain, her wish was always for courage. She was very aware of courage and did not want to be found lacking. And there was, it was really quite hairy when the flak came in. And she did pretty well. And then, having done that, she was picked to go for officer training. And she was very, very happy as Sergeant Mary Churchill by now, with her battery in Enfield, but decided that she should go to train for taking a commission. It was the less comfortable route, but again, she felt that if she could do it, she should do it. And indeed, by the end of the war, they were very active when the V1, the Doodlebug campaign came in. She was very active with her battery then. And then, amazingly, the battery was chosen to go to Europe in the wake of D-Day. And was it the Bulge? Anyway. And she ended up as a junior commander with more than 200 girls under her command.
It's so impressive.
So it's pretty impressive.
Did Winston ever go and visit Mary in Hyde Park when she was stationed there?
Never out of the place. He used to like taking official visitors. He took Harry Hopkins, he took the Regent of Iraq, and then he wrote a letter to Randolph in 1944 saying, I visit Mariah's battery in Hyde Park to watch the child firing the guns.
And she was little more than a child, just a teenager.
She was 21 at most.
Incredible. Sarah, similarly, she's a little bit older than Mary, but still a very young woman. And it was very special for me to think about being the same age that Sarah Churchill was at this time during the war as I was working on this book and thinking, would I have the courage to do what she did and what Mary did at that age or younger? And it's probably not something you know until you're in that position, but like you said, they each had a real sense of duty and determination to do their bit just like anyone else. And I think that's really admirable about each of them. And alongside the pride that Winston had in them for that very reason, they also were presented with some really unique opportunities to work directly with him during the war as his aide-de-camp at several of the wartime conferences.
Indeed. My mother went with him in 1943 to the Quebec conference and then on to the USA, where she stayed at the White House. She had a very good line. Somebody once said to her, "How old were you when you went to America first?" And she said, 20 years old when I stayed with FDR at the White House. It's a very good line.
That is an excellent line.
But it was totally true.
Yes.
And she had a wonderful trip. The Americans really took her to their heart and were sweet to her. And she went and she addressed 2,000 women war workers at the Bendix radio factory, which she said was completely terrifying. But apparently she did very well. And then she had some lovely times with her father. They went up to the Catskills. And there's a moment he's lying in the sun after lunch, gazing at the blue sky, and he says to her, I'm so glad that God made the sky blue and the trees green and not the other way round. It was so much better for painting. And she says at the end of this rather charming entry, she said, I so value these golden moments with my father.
And they really were kind of even in the midst of the war, and they valued these moments really as a chance to be father and daughter. Even though they were on the forefront of history, I think it's easy to forget that someone like Winston Churchill, yes, of course, he is a great leader. He's the reason we're all gathered here today. But at the end of the day, he's just someone's dad as well. And what would it be like to be his child? Not only to see history at his side, but just to learn from him as your parent. And I think that that's something that kind of can maybe help when history feels very removed from us, to bring it back a little bit more towards our own lives and realize that history really isn't so very far away.
I think that my mother, I don't know, because maybe there were lots of other times that she didn't write about, but she made a point of writing about. If she'd go out, he'd call her up to his room to have lunch with him while he was working in bed. She always wrote about it, And then she used to only stay an hour because she was frightened of boring him.
I would say it could certainly be an intimidating person. I know when Sarah was a little girl, she'd write down notes that she wanted to say to him. She was too afraid to say it just extemporaneously. She'd practice and rehearse it and write it down and deliver it to him in a note, which is kind of surprising for a girl who grew up to become an actress, that she would have almost a stage fright in front of her father. But I think that it's, but kind of the opportunity that they had to be with their father was something that certainly wasn't lost on them, nor to contribute really on the front lines of the war with them. And one of the reasons perhaps that Mary wrote her diaries and Sarah wrote so many letters to her mother during the opportunities that she had to travel with her father to the Tehran and Yalta conferences, because they had this very acute sense that they were living through history and that they needed to record their place in it. And that was kind of part of their job also as an aide-de-camp. When I think about Sarah serving as the aide at Tehran, first when the big three met for the very first time and discussed the D-Day landings and the plans for D-Day, and then again at Yalta in 45, the last meeting of the big three. And I think of the reasons that Sarah was chosen for this role, similar to Mary, it's kind of, I think of it almost in four ways. First, because of their writing abilities. Winston wants to write about his wartime experiences after. He wants to write the memoirs as he did after the First World War, and he needs someone there who can record what's taking place around the conference to give that detail and that life to the proceedings beyond kind of the official minutes. And then Sarah's experience of having been an actress, it lent itself so nicely to diplomacy in a way, where you think about the kind of the doublespeak and the nuances and almost the role that you have to play in front of the Soviets or in front of the Americans. And it was something that came very naturally to her, along with the actual war experience she'd had in uniform.
I mean, they were sort of secret diplomatic weapons.
Exactly.
Really. Certainly my mother, de Gaulle found her very, very charming. And she sat next to him at lunch several times, and she had to entertain his rather dull daughter. And But, and she revered the French so much, so that the leader of the Free French to her was anyway a demigod. But I mean, I'm sure her father knew what he was doing when he put her next to him at lunchtime.
Absolutely. I mean, who could you trust more than your daughter in some of these environments where spies were running amok all over the place, everybody had an agenda. To know that you can trust someone completely as the weight of the world is on your shoulders, as you're laying the plans for D-Day, trying to end the war, come to some sort of agreement with the Soviets, who are certainly bugging you everywhere and listening in. Mysterious lemon trees arriving at the conference after Sarah mentions, oh, this caviar would be nice with a twist of lemon, and poof, the next day there's a lemon tree. But it's just amazing that the kinds of people that they were also interacting with as very young women, not necessarily an equal stature to FDR or Stalin, but certainly in a capacity where they were very well respected by the leaders of the day and very well known to them.
Absolutely. And then there was that sort of second level of all the SIGs and Portal and somebody who my mother and her best friend Judy called Glamour Pants, who was Lord Louis Mountbatten. So they were very much at ease with all that sort of level of high military, if you like.
Exactly.
As well as not being intimidated by sitting down to dinner with FDR.
Exactly.
And then being cheeky enough to write afterwards. He makes me laugh, but he also bores me.
Well, the interactions with FDR certainly were very memorable for both of them. And I think about Mary meeting FDR in the White House, Sarah then meeting him at Tehran, and really being so charmed by him. And she was really appreciative that during the conference, he raised a glass to toast her. And he said, I would come to you, my dear, but I can't, because of course he was paralyzed. And so Sarah came around to him, and this is something that really struck her. But she also found herself feeling very let down by FDR by the end, kind of on behalf of her father, but also given the astute sense of geopolitical relationships that both she and Mary had. They could both feel by the end of the war that something had shifted with the Americans and with the relationship between Churchill and FDR. And Sarah, not realizing that FDR was incredibly ill by the time of the Yalta conference, the first time she sees him and feels that something is different, she writes to her mother saying, is it his health or has he moved away a little from us? And it was both.
This was rather encouraged by Anna, wasn't it? Anna Roosevelt. Didn't she take quite a sort of definite political line herself?
She did, yes.
Not very ADC.
No, and the nuances of the role are so important, and I think it's kind of the diplomatic importance of that is, it's almost like if you do your job very well, no one knows you were there, and it's only if you make a mess of it they'd know. And so it is this role that goes unsung in many situations. But Anna Roosevelt, who came to Yalta,
she took quite a lot upon herself.
She did, but without the experience that Mary and Sarah had to understand the nuances of it.
My mother had a more humble idea about what an ADC did certainly than Anna Roosevelt. She wrote to her mother from Potsdam, I'm turning my sword into a duster. Because she was rearranging all the furniture for the dinner that night, and arranging flowers and all that. Being, she regarded it as you just got on and did whatever needed doing. Exactly,
and whether that's arranging flowers or setting a table, which is also extremely important in diplomacy because if somebody's name is spelled wrong or they're seated next to a person with whom they have a grievance, they carry that frustration in the conference room the next day and things don't go as well as they could. So even though I think it's sometimes easy to write off a role that someone like a Mary or a Sarah or an Anna Roosevelt would play, whether it's kind of staying up with Winston until 2 o'clock in the morning, discussing frustration he has towards FDR regarding Poland as he goes through the diplomatic pouch, or if it is kind of overseeing some more of the logistical elements, it all goes into successful diplomacy, and you can't have one without the other. And I think it's important to understand that role holistically, and it's so much more than just setting a table and setting out flowers.
But also, lest we forget, there was Churchill's health wasn't always the best. So it was really important to Whitehall that there would be a member of the family around just in case he was taken ill, and as indeed he was. And I think that was a sort of major consideration, wasn't it? After Tehran, he had to stop on the way home.
Yes, he was extremely ill, and
Yeah.
Sarah was with him and read Pride and Prejudice aloud to him to pass the time while he was ill, and then Clementine came and met them. He seemed to have a habit of getting sick and falling ill every single time he'd go on one of these adventures.
But when you looked at the aeroplanes they were using, I mean, they were just unbelievable.
Oh, my
really,
gosh.
in terms of temperature and the time it took to, you know, to travel, etc.
Exactly.
So it was not for wimps.
No, when you think about the kinds of conferences that people have today and summits where there are months of planning that's involved, and teams and teams of security, and every detail is overseen, there's no way that any security team today would allow a prime minister or a president to undertake the kind of personal danger that these leaders were willing to take to meet with Stalin to further the war, because of the importance of meeting in person. And I think that's something also helpful to keep in mind in the times where we are now as we think about returning to that type of diplomacy in person.
Just to add a bit of colour to what you so rightly say, my mother was with her father on the day after VE Day in London, and he had to travel to the Allies' embassies to deliver the papers of surrender or something. And there was she in the car with her father. The crowds were unbelievable, of excited, happy, grateful people, and 4 policemen. That's all there was.
It's just incredible.
It's incredible.
Truly, when you think about the hundreds of security personnel that would be with them in that situation today.
Imagine the POTUS, the spirits.
The other thing that I loved about really coming to understand Sarah and her relationship with Mary and the unique experience they had during the war was it really was for each of them very much a coming-of-age story, realizing what they were capable of, the fact that joining the military gave them a sense of freedom that perhaps you don't necessarily associate with the military, but really the chance to go out into the world and discover something of themselves.
Yeah. And in my mother's case, to leave home for the first time ever.
To leave home, for
Yes,
Sarah
exactly.
to be on her own in the world and responsible for herself.
That's it. So it was indeed a sort of, and I think many people that have come home from the military now, as then, very changed by the experience, hopefully in a good way. And it certainly, as you say, was a coming of age. Interestingly, at the end of the war, my mother was happy to return to being her parents' daughter, whereas Sarah wanted, didn't she, to went on and went to America to continue her career.
She did. I think the sense of freedom that she had to kind of find herself in during the war is something that she wanted to maintain for at least some period when the war was over. She wanted to continue with her career as an actress. She wanted to see more of the world as she had done during the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And that was something that was very important to her. And yet, even though they went kind of and pursued different paths in the aftermath of the war, the bond between them remained very strong for the rest of their lives.
And indeed, when my mother finally met Christopher Soames, who she went on to marry less than a year later, he first met Sarah. They went to Rome and he met Sarah, and she wrote a very supportive letter to their parents about him, and which I'm sure smoothed the path of true love. And an engagement was announced shortly after. So she was very supportive of my mother.
Oh,
and I know it went the other way as well.
Absolutely. Sarah certainly had challenges later in life, but Mary was always there for her. And I think maybe some of that comes not only from being sisters, but sisters with a relationship forged through really being a very tiny handful of people who could understand what that world was like and what their position had been during the war years. And I think that that's something that's exceptional that comes out through their letters, and I'm so excited that people are now able to read that and have in Mary's own words through your wonderful volume of edited letters, and it's such a treat to read, and I hope all of you enjoy reading it as much as I have.
Thank you.
Should we open it up to some questions from the audience now? And as ever, if you have a question, please wait for the microphone to reach you. Justin.
This question is for Emma. in reading Catherine's book, she talks about how the family really always wanted a family member to accompany Sir Winston on any of his trips throughout the war. You know, Mary did, and Sarah did. Was there anything in the diaries about conversations between Mary and Sarah about who would accompany Winston on the specific trips, like to Quebec or to Yalta? Was there any correspondence between them about that?
Not directly between
No.
the two of them, I don't think. No, it was sort of, I think it was worked out which one of them could, you know, logistically go, rather than them discussing between the two of them. And I think it was appropriate, probably, that Sarah went to Yalta. She's more experienced. I mean, I'm sure my mother would have done her best job possible, but...
Well, she went soon after to Potsdam, and that was also challenging in its own way with the election coming and interrupting the middle of the conference and the devastating news for Churchill in the very middle of that.
They never went back.
No, and just it's, you know, do you think Mary had a sense that she might not return to the conference with her father?
No, I think everybody was quite confident. I think it was, I think she says in her diaries, it was more of an au revoir than an adieu when they left, and everybody was quite confident that they'd be back a few days later. And then, of course, it was absolutely devastating to the whole family. I think my mother picked herself up quicker than my parents didn't sort of pick themselves up for a bit, really. But
well, Sarah was there on the election day as well with Mary and wrote so eloquently about hearing the devastating news. She'd gone to get her hair done earlier in the day because she was too nervous to sit and wait for the returns to come in. And so she came home, and then they all learned the news together. And I love the quotation from Clementine saying, well, perhaps this is a surprise for the, what does he say? This is a gift or a surprise for the best? And he says it's very well disguised, or a blessing in disguise, very well disguised.
But he also, you know, he was such a Democrat, as we know. He couldn't, so he was, I think, very upset, but the people had spoken. So he wasn't going to try and fight back. It was just living with it.
Exactly. But the aide-de-camp role kind of carried over for them in later years with him, including in the immediate aftermath of the election. Winston turns to Sarah once again right after that defeat and asks her to come with him to Italy, where he goes on a painting holiday and begins to process what it's like not to be receiving the boxes every single day and trying to adjust to this new way of living.
Void.
Exactly, and I think it's quite telling that he turned to his daughters in these situations, because I think for each of them, we all have someone like them in our lives where we have a hard time putting our finger on exactly what it is that they do that makes them so important to us. And yet we know it when we see it, but it rarely is a role that leaves a paper trail in history. Yeah. And that's unfortunate, because I think some of the greatest advisors and the greatest confidants are the people who often are missing in the historical record. And I certainly think of my own life and think of the people who play that role for me. And so I was very honored to be able to share a little bit of what that role is. Certainly Sarah in this instance, and Anna and Kathleen, and for you, your mother. And yet there's so many hundreds and thousands of people like that who play such a pivotal role in history, but most people will never know their names. So to give them an opportunity to speak for themselves and almost put them back into the historical record was something that was very special for me.
It's a wonderful opportunity to be able to, and also in the case of my mother's diaries, to add something to the really quite valid, I think, to the canon. I mean, she was a charming person, my mother, and one can see where it came from. Really.
In composing the edited volume of your mother's diaries, was there anything that you learned that surprised you about her that you never would have expected about her? There
were several things. Well, one, I was surprised by, at the beginning of her, when she was 16, 17, how unbelievably unconfident she was. Because, of course, the woman I knew as my mother was, you never question your mother's confidence, really, and certainly I didn't have any reason to question mine. But she wasn't at all confident, and she was very torn as to what her role should be, and there was a lot of sort of teenage self-flagellation going on. And I just had no idea. You don't think of your mother as a child, so it was a huge privilege, really, to be able to look my 17-year-old mother in the eye.
Did she remind you of yourself at that age?
A bit, yes, actually. But I think I was naughtier than that. She was incredibly well behaved, my mother.
Well, she had to fight a war.
Well, yes, except she got engaged and had to get unengaged, but I mean...
That was one of my favorite parts of learning about the story of Mary and Sarah and the Harriman family involved in that. So Averil Harriman was the Lend-Lease envoy in London early in the war, and he and his daughter Kathleen became very close friends with your family. And then they went on to Moscow later, but everyone stayed in touch, of course. And Averil Harriman was known as being quite a frosty and unemotional person. And he really wouldn't get involved in any of the kind of affairs of the heart for his own daughters. And he was not, a touchy-feely kind of dad who would come and give you a hug if you were feeling sad. But yet there's this amazing interaction between Mary and Averil Harriman where she's thinking about getting engaged. And he is the person that Clementine turns to persuade her against this because she's just a bit too young and doesn't know him very well. And I just thought that was so out of character for Averil Harriman, and yet there must have been something special about your mother that propelled him to intervene.
Well, no, actually, I think it was my grandmother that propelled him. My grandmother's idea of a Lonely Hearts advisor was Averil Harriman. And also Harry Hopkins got drawn into it too. So my mother was given these sort of spine-stiffening walks around the lawn at Chequers to make her see the right of not getting engaged to this poor young man. I mean, he was perfectly charming, I'm sure. But Clementine had decided it was not to happen, so...
Well, despite Averil Harriman being perhaps the least likely person to give advice on love and affairs of the heart, I'm very glad that he did, because without Averil Harriman, you may not be sitting with us here today.
You're
so thank you,
right.
Averil Harriman, for that. So I think with that, I think we've run out of time for questions, unfortunately. But so we're going to take a little bit of a break now. But first, thank you so much, Emma, for this wonderful discussion. It has been such a pleasure getting to know you the last few years, and I'm so happy that we could do this together today.
It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And so we will take a short break. We will come back at 3 UK time, where we'll be joined by Charlotte Jones from Paul Roget. And now I hope that you will all enjoy this wonderful video of Elliot Clark, who is a recipient of the Churchill Scholarship, talking about his PhD research on the Churchill family, and a glimpse of some of the scholarship that we can see in the years to come. So thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the video. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Emilio Sanfrances. I am the head of the Department of International Relations at Comillas Pontifical University. I am also the director of the Churchill Institute we have created at our university. We are glad to introduce you the Winston Churchill Institute, Innovation, Europe, and Spain, United Kingdom Relations, a new Churchill-related project launched by our department and university. Brexit referendum represented a major turning point in the history of the European Union. It created a radically new scenario for politics, for society, culture, and also for the business community, one that remains both fluid and dynamic. The United Kingdom is the third largest country with direct investment in Spain and was its largest investor within the European Union. Cultural and political ties are deeply rooted in both countries' histories. The new and shifting scenario calls for innovation, new approaches from the academia, and will require research, rigorous analysis, and a lot of reflection. The Winston Churchill Institute, Innovation, Europe, and Spain, United Kingdom Relations, takes its name from Winston Churchill. For us, a unique, visionary 20th century politician. Much more than that, a historical figure who never wavered on the importance of Europe to the United Kingdom and the need for a strong relationship. As a great global leader, Sir Winston Churchill was fundamental to the creation of the modern international order. He was always sensitive to the importance of scientific innovation, He won the Nobel Prize for Literature and embraced painting, winning acclaim for his artworks. He was also a key player in the promotion of British-Spanish relations, and as an old member of the community of European nations, Spain was a country for him that was to be liked and admired. From this singular approach to innovation, the Institute aims to be a platform for meetings, to foster debates for all those concerned with the development of strong relations between the United Kingdom and Spain, led by companies, institutions, and individuals committed to their advancement. Which are our planned outcomes? First of all, to produce high-quality research in the Institute chosen fields, to assist donor companies and academic institutions. We want to organize international meetings and conferences, taking advantage of the academic prestige of our university, Comillas Pontifical University in Madrid. We will organize an annual conference on Winston Churchill and innovation, and we will promote major exhibitions and cultural activities associated with the figure of Sir Winston Churchill. Which is our history so far? Our short history has been deeply affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. We launched our first activities in early 2020 with the inauguration of the exhibition Churchill and Spain, curated by Jimmy Burns Marañón and offered by one of our partners, the British-Spanish Society. The exhibition was opened with a keynote speech by Professor Peter Maitland. The 12th of February 2020, we celebrated our first Churchill conference with the title of Managing Brexit, Innovation as a Key Factor. It was inaugurated by the British ambassador in Spain, with contributions of key personalities in the field of British-Spanish relations, as Charles Power, director of Elcano Institute, Ignacio Peiró, director of Cervantes Institute in London, Carlos del Cló, president of Vidrala. All of them provided their insights in this specific topic. Also in February 2020, we celebrated a masterclass on the challenges of global education in collaboration with another of our relevant partners, the British Council. Now the COVID crisis is coming hopefully to an end, we are excited to retake many of our postponed projects, and doing so, we hope to continue honoring the important figure of Sir Winston Churchill. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Elliot Clark, and I'm a postgraduate student at the University of Plymouth and the Graduate Research Fellow of the National Churchill Leadership Centre at George Washington University. I first started my study of the Churchill dynasty 3 years ago with my undergraduate dissertation, which was titled The Shadowed Advisor. This was a study analysing the role of Clementine Churchill in aiding her husband's political career, but also looking at the implications Churchill's political commitments had on the duo's marriage. This started with looking at the First World War and how Clementine would engineer lunches with ministers to show Churchill's bravery on the front line. Moving on to Churchill's wilderness years, where we see Clementine supporting and advising him as he looks to re-enter the House of Commons. And then finally, the Second World War, as Churchill finds himself in his premiership, and Clementine supports his work while also producing her own work with the Aid to Russia Fund. For this study, I was lucky enough to have the support of the Jenny Churchill Fund, which allowed me to facilitate a trip to the Churchill Archive Centre. Here, I was able to search through private correspondence and diary entries to truly understand the Churchill marriage. Now, as a postgraduate student, I look to continue my study of the Churchill dynasty, now looking at Churchill and fatherhood. This will involve using historiography and press reports to understand the changing beliefs of fatherhood throughout the 20th century. It's well known that Churchill endured a difficult relationship with his own father. This study will look at when becoming a father himself, Churchill looked for a much more close and affectionate relationship with his own children, but soon realised the implications his political career would have on these relationships. Throughout their lives, the Churchill children developed a unique set of skills as they grew up in their father's world. They'd illustrate these skills in the outbreak of the Second World War as they acted as advisors to their father while simultaneously actively involving themselves in the war effort. Churchill's relationship with his children will be analysed and assessed through letters and diaries produced at the time, but also through the reports of the press. To facilitate this study, I have received the support of the National Churchill Leadership Centre in the form of a graduate research fellowship. This offers me a unique opportunity to work with a team who can offer support and advisory on how to pursue my research further. I also now have the opportunity to spend more time in the archives, researching and exploring new material to offer new insight to the public into Churchill's private life behind closed doors. I look forward to working with the National Churchill Leadership Centre over the coming years, and I thank them for their support.